You're watching Saturday Anime on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Greetings, this is Reverend Paul, and this, of course, is Studio Chojin Raw. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I was looking through the Studio Chojin YouTube channel analytics, and I happened to notice that the #1 search term associated with this channel is anime sex. That's right, beating out all other search terms, the search term that is most associated with Studio Chojin is the term anime sex. And I think that is pretty fucking badass. I mean, of all the things you could associate yourself with, I think anime sex is a pretty badass thing. And I see this as a real opportunity because, you see, I feel like there is a tendency within the so-called anime community to kind of look down their nose at anime sex, to act like this is something to scoff at. There are plenty of people out there who want to bitch about fan service. There are plenty of people out there who will never admit to ever watching hentai. And if they do admit to watching hentai, they'll have to give you some kind of bullshit justification for it. Nobody will just tell you, yes, I like fucking hentai. Nobody, except for me. I will tell you, fuck yeah, I like hentai. Fuck yeah, I like fan service. Fuck yeah, I like anime sex. There is nothing better, as far as I'm concerned, as a giant pair of anime titties bouncing around. That shit is pretty fucking awesome. And so, I am taking this opportunity, and I've decided that going forward, I'm going to brand Studio Chojin. I'm going to brand this channel your #1 source for anime sex. So with that said, let's take this opportunity to celebrate this channel's rebranding, and let's talk about one of my favorite animes, a little anime called Kekko Kamen. Now, if you're not familiar with Kekko Kamen, it is a character created by the one and only Go Nagai. And if you don't know who Go Nagai is, what the fuck is up with you? How can you not know who Go Nagai is? Go Nagai is fucking awesome. I feel like the best way to describe Go Nagai is to imagine a cross between Stan Lee and Robert Crumb. Go Nagai is probably the most influential manga artist, second only to Osamu Tezuka. Go Nagai is the creator of such titles as Devilman, Cutie Honey, Mazinger Z. In fact, one can even say Go Nagai invented the magical girl genre with Cutie Honey, and one can even say that Go Nagai helped to define what we would call the modern mech genre with Mazinger Z. And if that wasn't enough, Go Nagai is probably the reason we have fan service in anime. Go Nagai was a dude who was not afraid to bring a lot of sexuality into his comics. In fact, Go Nagai is credited with inventing the modern erotic manga genre with his title Harenchi Gakuen, which in 1968, at the time of its release, was extremely controversial because at that time, sexuality and nudity were not very common in Japanese manga. So Go Nagai is a pretty important dude, and you've definitely heard of his characters Devilman, Cutie Honey, and Mazinger Z. In fact, those are usually the three characters people bring up anytime Go Nagai's name is mentioned. But I feel like a character people don't talk about enough is Kekko Kamen. Kekko Kamen, to some extent, is an often overlooked creation of Go Nagai. I wouldn't say the character is obscure, but the character certainly hasn't reached the popularity of Devilman or even Cutie Honey. And this is evident in the fact that there is only one anime adaptation of Kekko Kamen. The character of Kekko Kamen originally appeared in Monthly Shonen Jump in 1974, and it wasn't until 17 years later that Kekko Kamen appeared in her own anime title. So the Kekko Kamen OVA was released in 1991, and it serves as a great introduction to the character of Kekko Kamen. The Kekko Kamen anime takes place at the Spartan Institute, which is an elite high school that is known for turning out top-level students. The students who attend graduate with extremely high grades and go on to go to elite universities and get great jobs. So needless to say, it is a pretty big big deal to be a student at the Spartan Institute. And in the first episode of the Kekko Kamen anime, we see the teaching methods that create this elite class of students. And the training methods, to say the least, are extremely fucking strict. The first episode opens up at a late night study hall that the instructor, Teacher Ben, refers to as a midnight concentration camp. And in this midnight concentration camp, students are being forced to stay up late and memorize the lesson, and any student that falls asleep is going to be severely punished. And it's at this point we are introduced to the character of Mayumi Takahashi, who is one of the main characters of the series. Mayumi is a girl at the Spartan Institute who is having a hard time. She is not a great student, and one can't help but wonder how she even got into this fucking school to begin with, but for whatever reason, she's there and she's having a really fucking hard time learning this shit, and she is falling asleep. She cannot stay awake during this late night study hall, and then Teacher Ben, the instructor, notices this and decides that Mayumi needs to be punished severely for failing her assignment. And things are only going to get worse for Mayumi going forward, because you see, the principal of the school, known as the Big Toenail of Satan, that is totally this dude's fucking name. Just knowing that, you know this place is not a place to fuck around. So anyway, the principal, the Big Toenail of Satan, he has just hired a new punishment teacher, and this new punishment teacher is a woman named Gestapo. I think the best way to describe the look of Gestapo is to imagine if the game World Heroes had a Nazi dominatrix character. And so, because Mayumi has completely failed this late night study hall, she is now sent into the dungeon of the Spartan Institute, and she is going to be tortured by Miss Gestapo to the delight of the principal, the Big Toenail of Satan, and Teacher Ben, because the principal and Teacher Ben are two fucking perverted dudes who just love torturing their female students. And the thing we're going to find out with Kekko Kamen is that this is a series that has tons of nudity. If there's one thing this series is going to deliver, it's going to be on the nudity. So Miss Gestapo proceeds to whip the clothes off of Mayumi, and it's at this point our hero enters the scene. The titular character, no pun intended, Kekko Kamen enters and saves Mayumi from this torture. And it's at this point we get our first good look of the character of Kekko Kamen. What makes Kekko Kamen so awesome is that, sure, she's a superhero, and like most superheroes, she has a mask, gloves, and boots, and she even has a signature superhero weapon with her nunchucks. But unlike other superheroes, that's all she fucking wears, because other than her mask, boots, and gloves, she's completely fucking naked. Her tits are out, her ass is out, all is on display for the world to see, and it fucking rules. Dare I say, Kekko Kamen has the sexiest superhero costume ever, because despite what people might tell you, there is no sexier costume than no costume at all. It is always sexier to be naked than wearing clothes. I think this is great, and I'd love to see this happen in more comics. I think there needs to be more naked female superheroes. That would rule. This is one of the reasons why this show is going to completely deliver on the nudity, because even if Mayumi doesn't get naked, even if there isn't another character in this show that's going to get naked, Kekko Kamen is totally going to be naked all the fucking time, because that is her thing. She is the naked fucking superhero. But that's part of the reason why she is so badass. And it's not just because I'm a fucking perv who likes to see naked anime girls. No, there is actually a really interesting reason for why Kekko Kamen is naked, but it's also cool that she's naked because I'm a perv who likes to look at naked anime girls. So anyway, Kekko Kamen saves Mayumi and she leaps off into the night. And the Great Toenail of Satan and Teacher Ben and Miss Gestapo, they pursue her to stop her. Unfortunately for them, Kekko Kamen manages to get away, but she does leave a clue that could help the evil teachers discover her true identity. Now, I realized everything I just said sounds really fucking crazy, but trust me, it's going to get crazier, because you see, the Big Toenail of Satan and Teacher Ben are obsessed with finding out the true identity of Kekko Kamen, and the only clue they have to her true identity is this pair of panties that, for whatever reason, Kekko Kamen mistakenly dropped. But how are they supposed to know who this underwear belongs to? Well, we end up finding out that Teacher Ben is an expert panty sniffer, and he happens to know the smell of every chick in this school's underwear. And just by the scent on the panties alone, Teacher Ben is able to deduce that these particular pair of underwear belong to a specific student, and that student is Yuka Chigusa. And Yuka Chigusa is the perfect candidate for Kekko Kamen. She is athletic, she is strong, and she has a big pair of boobs, which is a reoccurring theme in this anime. Characters are constantly talking about how big Kekko Kamen's tits are, and it's one of the key characteristics that they use to narrow down who they could suspect to be Kekko Kamen. So the big toenail of Satan and Teacher Ben are pretty sure Yuka Chigusa is Kekko Kamen, but they're not completely sure. So they devise a plan that will force Yuka Chigusa to reveal her identity as Kekko Kamen. And they do that by calling an assembly and gathering all these students of the Spartan Institute in one place. And when they have all the students' attention, they take Mayumi Takahashi and they put her on a giant swastika so Miss Gestapo could throw knives at her to slowly tear off her clothes. And it's at this point Yuka Chigusa knows she has to do something. She just can't sit there and let this absurd spectacle go any further. So Yuka Chigusa steps in and stops Miss Gestapo from torturing Mayumi. And it seems pretty cut and dry at that point that Yuka Chigusa is Kekko Kamen. But that is not the end of the story, because it's at that moment Kekko Kamen appears and she starts to beat the shit out of all the Nazi faculty members, and then she beats the shit out of the big toenail of Satan. And this is a great scene because this is where we see Kekko Kamen's signature finishing move. And her signature finishing move involves her jumping high in the air and spreading her legs and then bashing the dude's face into her crotch and then using her legs to grip them even tighter and suffocate them with her crotch. And it's a move she calls the muffification technique. This show is fucking crazy. This is a fucking crazy show. What's also really cool about Kekko Kamen's muffification technique is that it is not a technique that induces pain. Like, when the bad guys are getting knocked out by Kekko Kamen's muffification, it's not because they're being hit with tons of force. The reason they pass out is because Kekko Kamen's pussy is so magical that it makes bad guys pass out and forces them to reassess their decisions in life. They're like, why the fuck am I even fighting, man? I'm just gonna sit here and enjoy the moment. So anyway, Kekko Kamen's muffification technique knocks out the big toenail of Satan. And Teacher Ben is not so lucky. He does not get to be smothered by Kekko Kamen's crotch. Kekko Kamen takes her fucking nunchucks and beats the shit out of this motherfucker. So then that only leaves Miss Gestapo. And how is Kekko Kamen going to deal with Miss Gestapo? Because as a chick, she is not going to be susceptible to Kekko Kamen's muffification technique. And presumably with her whip, she's just as formidable as Kekko Kamen is with her nunchucks. It's basically the unstoppable force meeting the immovable object. Luckily, Kekko Kamen is not just a piece of ass. She is not just a hot chick because she has a lot of brains too. And she deduces that because Miss Gestapo is a bondage queen, she's a chick who's into S&M, she realizes that Miss Gestapo likes to be dominated just as much as she likes to dominate. So Kekko Kamen uses her nunchucks to rip the clothes off of Miss Gestapo, and Miss Gestapo loves it. She has a fucking orgasm and fucking surrenders, and Kekko Kamen has saved the day, and she goes off into the night to do more good and search for fun and meaning. So it seems pretty clear Kekko Kamen is a pretty wild and crazy show. And that's what makes this series so great. It's a series that is just not afraid to be as ridiculous and over the top as possible. I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways, Kekko Kamen is probably the most over the top and the most ridiculous anime you will ever see. And the first episode of Kekko Kamen is the perfect introduction into this world, and it's a perfect introduction to the series of Kekko Kamen itself. I think the cast of characters in Kekko Kamen are pretty awesome. They're all pretty one-dimensional, but they're entertaining as fuck. Specifically, the big toenail of Satan. What I love about the big toenail of Satan is that he's kind of like a perverted Skeletor. He is conniving and he is nefarious, but he is goofy, and you cannot take this motherfucker seriously. And I think he really steals the show in Kekko Kamen. Unlike a lot of other anime, Kekko Kamen is actually very episodic. It doesn't really have an overarching story that carries through to each episode. In a lot of ways, Kekko Kamen is almost like a Saturday morning cartoon, where each episode is a standalone adventure and it features a different villain who Kekko Kamen has to go up against. And that's actually a really smart way to present this show for a couple of reasons. First off, as I said, it's a ridiculous show and it's a show that's about spectacle. If the plot of this show got too fucking fucking complicated, you would not be able to appreciate just how fucking ridiculous this stuff could be. So the fact that these plots are so simple and it just boils down to good guy versus bad guy really lets the absurd nature of this show shine, and that's what makes this show so entertaining. I do feel like there are people out there who are quick to dismiss Kekko Kamen as a piece of trashy fan service. But what these people don't realize is that even though Go Nagai is a pretty weird and crazy dude, he is also a brilliant writer and brilliant satirist. And underneath the ridiculousness of Kekko Kamen is this really, really interesting satire of Japanese society and Japanese pop culture. When you start to watch the first couple of episodes of Kekko Kamen, it becomes pretty obvious that Kekko Kamen is an indictment of the Japanese educational system. When the Kekko Kamen manga first came out in the 70s, Japan was known for having a very, very strict educational system. It got so bad that the Japanese government was forced to reform their educational system, and in modern times have adopted what's called the Yutori technique of teaching, which emphasizes creative learning and is supposed to put less pressure on its students. But with that said, Kekko Kamen is a bit of a time capsule, and it is a critique of the pre-Yutori Japanese educational system. In the world of Kekko Kamen, the teachers are literal Nazis who are forcing students to learn lessons in the most inhumane ways possible. And when these students don't conform, they are brutally punished by this horrible system. When you start looking at the series in that context, the role of Kekko Kamen starts to be very clear. Kekko Kamen represents rebelling against an oppressive system. And I mentioned earlier that there was actually a reason for her to be naked aside from the fan service aspect. And the reason Kekko Kamen is naked, when you look at it in the satirical sense, it is because she is rebelling against this system that is indoctrinating people. She is the only character in the school who is not wearing a uniform. She is the only character who is embracing herself. She is embracing her body, and she is rejecting the teachings of this school. Kekko Kamen is the only character in the show who is not afraid to be herself. Kekko Kamen's embracement of her nudity is a symbol for a person embracing themselves and not being ashamed of being who they really are. And this is why the students idolize Kekko Kamen, because she is the symbol of rebelling against this horrible system. And when you start to look at the Kekko Kamen series in that context, it becomes really obvious that Kekko Kamen is actually a pretty fucking smart show. And the satire of Kekko Kamen doesn't end with the Japanese educational system. Kekko Kamen is also satirizing the superhero genre. In fact, Kekko Kamen herself is a parody of the Japanese superhero Gekko Kamen, also known as the Moonlight Mask, who is sort of like the Japanese equivalent of the Lone Ranger. And Kekko Kamen's arch nemesis, the Big Toenail of Satan, is actually a parody of Gekko Kamen's nemesis, the Claw of Satan. Even the character Teacher Ben is actually a satire of the TV show Ben Casey, which was a medical drama in the 60s, and when it came to Japan, it was the highest rated foreign TV show. I also like the fact that Mayumi Takahashi is pretty much a parody of Lois Lane. Like Lois Lane, Mayumi is constantly getting kidnapped, she's constantly in trouble, she's constantly getting tortured, and this happens so many times that the show even makes jokes about the fact that Mayumi is always in trouble and Kekko Kamen has to save her. I love the fact that the show parallels Superman in that way. And what I also think is really interesting, going back to the nudity of Kekko Kamen, is that when you think about superheroes, especially a superhero like Superman, is one of the core tenets of Superman is that Clark Kent has to strip off his clothes in order to become Superman. And Kekko Kamen is the extreme version of that. Her naked body is her superhero suit. And it's tapping into that kind of psychological aspect of the superhero, where underneath the clothes of a normal, everyday, average individual is this great, strong superhero. I mentioned before that the Kekko Kamen anime is based off of the manga of the same name, but what I think is worth pointing out is that the Kekko Kamen anime does not follow the story of the manga. In fact, none of the villains in the Kekko Kamen manga appear in the anime, with the exception of the Big Toenail of Satan and Teacher Ben. Although Teacher Ben in the anime is much different than his manga counterpart. The anime gives Teacher Ben a much more prominent role, and in the manga, Teacher Ben was a minor character who only appeared in one chapter. Also, in the manga, Teacher Ben is actually a sadistic teacher who's obsessed with vivisecting. And he's so tired of vivisecting frogs that he decides he wants to vivisect Mayumi's cat. And obviously, Mayumi can't have anything to do with this, so she saves her cat. Then Teacher Ben is so fucking pissed off that he has nothing to vivisect that he decides the best thing to do in that sense is to vivisect Mayumi. And then obviously, Kekko Kamen comes and beats the shit out of him. But in the anime, they make Teacher Ben more like the Great Toenail of Satan, where he's just kind of this goofy, perverted dude. I think it's a change that works for the show, but I kind of wish they made Teacher Ben a little bit more like his sadistic version in the manga. I think it would have given the show a little bit more variety. Another kind of change in the show, which I find a little peculiar, is the fact that they added in this little gag about Kekko Kamen being embarrassed about her nudity, which is strange because when you read the manga makes it very clear that Kekko Kamen's nudity is her superpower. The fact that Kekko Kamen is naked and embraces being naked, that's what makes her the hero she is. And this is perfectly illustrated in the story arc where Kekko Kamen fights Tarzania, the queen of the jungle. Tarzania is basically like the strongest woman in the world, and she is the only person who is pretty much a match for Kekko Kamen. And in the manga, she beats the shit out of Kekko Kamen. She fucking karate chops Kekko Kamen right in the fucking crotch. I mean, it is pretty fucked up how badly Kekko Kamen gets beaten. But Kekko Kamen manages to overcome Tarzania by ripping off her loincloth. And then Tarzania is so embarrassed that she can't finish the fight, and then Kekko Kamen fucking wins and beats the shit out of Tarzania. And then after the fight, Tarzania realizes that her greatest weakness is her shame. And the only way she could be like Kekko Kamen is to eliminate her shame completely. So Tarzania turns into the supervillain Omen Otep and starts to wreak havoc on the school. And I really wish they brought Omen Otep into the anime. Omen Otep is an awesome villain for Kekko Kamen. She's almost like the Venom to Kekko Kamen's Spider-Man. She is the inverse of Kekko Kamen. She's a naked chick who wears a pharaoh mask, and her ultimate technique is smothering people with her giant boobs. Which is the antithesis of Kekko Kamen's muffification technique. And it's like, this is a fight that was made for fucking anime. Why hasn't this fight happened? I can't be the only one in the world who wants to see this fight. We have to see an anime version of Omen Otep versus Kekko Kamen. I gotta see the muffification versus the giant boob suffocation. I gotta see these two fucking techniques go at it because I don't know which one is better. I mean, which one would you rather be a victim of? Would you rather be smothered by Kekko Kamen's crotch, or would you rather be smothered by Omen Otep's boobs? I don't know. I need to see this play out in anime so I can make my choice, but I digress. Now, even though the villains from the Kekko Kamen manga don't appear in the anime, I think the villains in the Kekko Kamen anime are pretty cool. I thought Gestapico was a pretty cool addition to Kekko Kamen's gallery of rogues, and I also like the villain that appears in episode 2, which is a gym teacher named Schwarzenegtaru. And if you keep saying that name, Schwarzenegtaru, it becomes pretty clear who this character is supposed to be a parody of. Schwarzenegtaru is supposed to be a parody of Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he has a really great dynamic with Kekko Kamen because the anime establishes that Kekko Kamen is weak against good-looking muscular guys. When he starts to flex, she can't help but get aroused, and Schwarzenegtaru flexes so much that Kekko Kamen has an orgasm and is forced to run away. I thought this was a really interesting fight, and it felt very much in line with the type of fights Kekko Kamen would have in the manga. I also like the villain in the 3rd episode, which is a robot named Honoka, and she has electrified tentacles. And the 3rd episode of Kekko Kamen, to me, is the closest Kekko Kamen gets to being a hentai, where Mayumi gets attacked by the tentacles, and the tentacles are being wrapped around her boobs, and they're flicking her nipples, and it's like, okay, we're definitely getting into hentai territory here. I think the 4th episode of Kekko Kamen is pretty weak. I think that's the least interesting of the episodes, and I think the samurai character is an interesting idea, but I don't know, he's just not as interesting as the tentacle robot or the muscle-bound gym teacher or Miss Gestapico. I think the first 2 episodes are probably the strongest, and the episodes get progressively weaker, with the last episode being the worst. I think the thing that really saves the 4th episode is the cameos by Cutie Honey and Mazinger Z. That was pretty cool. Now, I also mentioned that there really isn't an overarching story to Kekko Kamen, and that's not really entirely true. Even though the anime doesn't really have an overarching story, the manga certainly does have one. The overarching story in the manga is trying to uncover the true identity of Kekko Kamen. This is only an idea that the anime hints at, but it is fully explored in the manga. Now, the anime introduces the character of Yuka Chigusa, who is a prime suspect for Kekko Kamen. But things get a little bit dicey when Yuka Chigusa and Kekko Kamen appear in the same place. However, in the manga, we find out that Yuka Chigusa is actually two people. Yuka Chigusa is actually twin sisters, one sister named Yuka and the other named Chigusa. And that little twist does add to the idea that either Yuka or Chigusa could actually be Kekko Kamen. But the mystery doesn't end there, because the manga introduces a gym teacher character named Keiko Natsuwani, who is an expert at nunchucks, and she very well could also be Kekko Kamen. But the plot still thickens because there is another character named Koichi Omote, who is a female character who dresses as a boy, which seems a little suspicious. She very well could be the true identity of Kekko Kamen. And the suspects don't stop there, because the school nurse is also a Kekko Kamen suspect, because she happens to know about injuries Kekko Kamen sustained that nobody else knows about, which is somewhat suspicious. So the mystery as to who Kekko Kamen actually is actually pretty deep. And I'm afraid that's something we're going to have to save for another video, because you see, like the Kekko Kamen anime, this video really only serves as an introduction to the Kekko Kamen character. We are totally coming back to Kekko Kamen, and we are going to talk about her again, because as you see, not only do we need to talk about the manga, but there are 11 live-action Kekko Kamen movies that we need to discuss. We are going to talk about everything Kekko Kamen at a later point in time. So, with that said, let me just say that the Kekko Kamen 4-part OVA series is a pretty awesome series. It's a great example of the crazy mind of Go Nagai. I definitely recommend it to people who love crazy anime, who love excessive nudity, and just want to have a little bit of fun.
西暦2636年、エイリアンの侵略が始まる。人類の未来をかけ、コントラが立ち上がる。戦いが今。スーパーファミコンアクションの頂点コントラスピリッツ。
Konami.
So this wraps up this week's edition of Studio Chojin Raw. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know I've been away for a little bit. I took last month off. I had some projects I needed to finish up. I'm looking forward to uploading this entire summer. This entire summer here at Studio Chojin, we'll be taking a look at classic anime. We're going to be looking at sexy anime. So be sure to check out the channel every week. And no mailbag this week. The video ran a little longer than I thought it would, so I will get to answering emails next week. I want to thank everybody who kept sending me email questions even during the break. That's awesome. I love hearing from everybody and answering everybody's questions. So please keep them coming. You could always send me a question or a comment here at studiochojin@gmail.com. Make the subject raw, and I will be happy to answer it on a future edition of this show. We will get back to answering emails next week. And like I said, plenty of big stuff on the horizon for Studio Chojin, so be sure to stick around. And I want to urge you to join the unholy army of the night and subscribe to the channel. Feel free to like the video and leave a comment. Any sort of support you can give the channel is greatly appreciated. And once again, this is Reverend Paul saying, until we meet again.